And we're going to get started with some intellectual heft this morning. Climate change is one of the breakout sessions we had, and it was packed. And who better to talk about climate change than someone who has $1 billion at their disposal to make an impact? Well, I shouldn't say an impact, because Dr. Sani was not about that kind of impact, but change, let's say, climate change. Arun Majumdar, known him for a long time. He was a Berkeley grad, and then I think under President Obama, they started a new department, or within the Department of Energy, a new program called ARPA-E, to really focus on renewable energy and all the things associated with that. Then he goes back to Stanford, and then he is now I don't know what your title is, Arun, but it seemed very complicated, but all I know is John Doerr, the famous venture capitalist at Kleiner Perkins, decided to donate $1 billion to Stanford to fight climate change, and Arun has been chosen and is responsible for making all that happen. So without further ado, Arun?
Thank you.
Slide.
Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. And thank you, MR, for your leadership. It's so good to see the Indian flag and the American flag right next to each other. So that's, let's celebrate. Let's celebrate the two largest democracies coming together. You talked about intellectual heft. Little did you realize you actually get physical heft as well. So. But great to be here. I missed the party yesterday. I also want to introduce my wife, Aruna, who is there. I have to say this to people, and you all will, of course, understand that, I had to change my name to Arun to match up with Aruna. Well, let me sort of offer some slides, and then I would rather focus on a Q&A. Because this is a topic that has so many dimensions, and the younger generation is so interested and keen and intensely involved in this that I think this deserves, for the next generation, some discussion. So, climate and sustainability, defining issue of the 21st century. Let me start with the horror movie. Okay, I want you to brace yourself for the horror movie. And then I'll talk about perhaps the good news. And because this is not something that we should sugarcoat, this is reality, and I want to give you the reality. And I'll use an analogy out here of the tsunami. The first tsunami I'm going to talk about is the human tsunami. This is the world population over the years, for the last million years. For the human population to go from 0 to about 300 million, the population in the United States, it took 1 million years. And what you see out here is not an exponential growth, but it's a super exponential growth. And it now takes 13 years to add another 1 billion people, okay? That's where we are. And this is, I call, the human tsunami, because the Earth, our Mother Earth, has never seen this before. This kind of a population explosion. And now, over the next 50, or by the end of the century, the prediction is that we're going to have 11 billion people, plus minus. The uncertainty is 1 billion, okay? And most of the population growth is going to be in Africa, because the fertility rate of women have not yet come down. In India, it's about 2.1 or so, and the population is stabilizing. But Africa, the population, and some parts of South Asia, the population is going to grow. It's not in North America or Europe. So this is a global South. We have to feed them. They deserve a quality of life that we all cherish, right? So that's the human population side, the human tsunami. There are a few other tsunamis that are associated with it, and partly by human design and some mistakes. The second one I call the human consumption tsunami. And that is, I'm plotting out there the total GDP, global GDP, and that's the inner curve, or that's the outer curve, sorry. And the inner curve is the global GDP is inside and the outside is global per capita GDP. Regardless of which way you take it, it is a super exponential growth. And we associate GDP with human prosperity and human welfare. Wrong idea. Because the person who developed the concept of GDP is an economist by the name of Simon Kuznets, who was at MIT. And during the Great Depression, Congress asked him, come up with a metric that we can look at our progress. And he came up with the concept of GDP, but he warned, don't associate GDP with human welfare. It is just a monetary aspect. It doesn't account for education. It doesn't account for access to health and other aspects of human welfare. But yet, this is where we have made some mistakes. We are now, if you use that as the metric of success, guess what you're going to get? You'll get human consumption, and people talk about GDP as a production, but you're producing because someone is consuming. And that is, I call the human consumption tsunami, right? When I was growing up in India, we had like 2 or 3 shirts and maybe a couple of pants with bell bottoms, remember? And now, I mean, we got a closet full, and I suspect the story is similar in your house as well. Okay? And to produce all these things, you need energy. And that's the energy consumption tsunami, most of it fossil energy. Okay, and this is only 1800s, this is only the last couple of 100 years. And this exponent, I put this markers of when I was born, when my parents were born, when my grandparents were born, and our children were born. Within 4 generations, we have just completely changed the way we produce things and the amount of energy, and almost all of it is fossil energy. 80% of the world runs on fossil energy. And there's no question that we have a carbon dioxide tsunami, right? And that has gone up to a point. The 2 things very important to note. One is that we have not seen this level of CO2 in the atmosphere for several million years, number one. And in the history of the Earth, we have never seen this kind of rate of increase of CO2. And I say rate because the Earth has its own time constant to adjust to things. It cannot adjust this fast a rise of CO2. And these are not independent, they're all related to each other. So it's very complex. You can do the same thing now with plastic tsunami. You can do the same thing as textile tsunami and many others. Now you see the complexity. The water consumption tsunami, right? The biodiversity tsunami. You can just keep at it. And this is the problem we have. So this is the horror movie I wanted to brace. And this has consequences. So, early in the morning, there's a quiz for you. Sorry, I'm a professor, so I have to give quizzes. No grading. 1 degree Celsius is the global average temperature rise since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's about 1.3, but let's just call it 1. And the Paris Agreement is 2 degrees Celsius, right? We want to keep it below 2. Actually 1.5, but 1.5 is kind of baked in, so let's forgive ourselves a little bit and give it 2. And this may seem nothing, but I'll show you, it is not the average that matters, it is the extreme. Like, we can put our head in the freezer and our feet in the heater, and we can say our average is fine, but we'll die, right? I mean, so it's not the average, but it's the extreme. I'm going to put you some more numbers, and I want you to guess what they mean. The next number is 800. Don't worry, this is not 800 degrees Celsius. This is not Venus. If you are to keep the global average temperature rise below 2 degrees, this is the amount of CO2 budget that the world has left with. This is 800 billion tons or trillion kilograms of CO2 that we can emit. Seems like a large number. I'll tell you how big that is. The next number is 40. What is that? 40 gigatons of CO2 per year. It's actually increasing now. That is the rate of emissions that the world produces per year. Okay? So even though 800 gigatons of CO2 seems like a large number, that's the rate of emissions. The next number is obvious, is 20 years. That's what we have really left to keep below 2 degrees, and 20 years is the next 2 decades. Next 2 decades, if you look back, I mean, our year started, 9/11 was 20 years ago, right? That's how much time we have left to address this problem seriously. And why do I say, I'll come back to the averages. It is not the averages, and let me show you the data observed by NASA, produced by NASA. This is, if you go on top of there, these are the summers. And you know, some of the summers are hotter, some of the cooler, but over time, 1970s, 1980s, some of you will remember, this is what is going on, okay? And so let me repeat this movie again. 1950s, 60s we were born, I was born in the 60s, and now this is going this way, and you can see there's only one direction it's going. It ain't going the other way. And so now the probability of those 2 sigma, 3 sigma events are happening at a much, much higher rate. The once in a century event is happening once in 30 years or once in 20 years. It'll happen within a lifetime. Those historic, the biblical flooding that happened in Pakistan, for example, because of the melting glaciers and torrential rain coming together, you know, 550 or 600 people, children died, right? And so the extreme event is where all these drought, wildfire, and you know, extreme heat and all of these are happening. And this is going to happen more often. In fact, right now we are part of one of our projects we have with Google is to put a global map of where things are happening in real time. Just like you had the Johns Hopkins website for COVID, you could go to the Johns Hopkins to find out what's going on. We are doing that right now. We're building that, hopefully release it sometime in early next year, of all the events that are going on, this massive wildfires that Australia faced. We had a heat wave out here. Heat wave out here we think is bad. Nothing compared to the heat wave that happened in India, where the wet bulb temperature touched 35 degrees Celsius. What does that mean? Wet bulb temperature is a combination of temperature and humidity. When the wet bulb temperature exceeds 35 degrees, reaches 35, humans do not survive because we can't sweat it out. Okay? Humans do not survive. If you have not read the book called The Ministry for the Future, how many of you have heard of the book Ministry for the Future? I would urge you to read the book. It's fiction, but it's too close to home because the book starts with an event of the wet bulb temperature exceeding 35 degrees Celsius in Uttar Pradesh. 20 million people died. Okay? And we call about 35 as a threshold. 30 to 35 vulnerable populations will be affected. Children, elderly people, etc. 25 to 30 is also pretty bad. This is the world we're entering. Sorry to not sugarcoat this, but that's the reality. Okay? Okay, what do we do about it? You know, we talked about gigatons, okay? Let me tell you, do a quick math. If you add up the total weight of all 8 billion human beings on Earth, how many gigatons is that? Because we're talking about 800 gigatons, 40 gigatons per year. Add up the weight of all human, some of you may be using a calculator right now, but let me give you the answer. It's half a gigaton, okay? Half a gigaton is the weight of all human beings on Earth, and we have to address 40 gigatons per year. Okay? That's the challenge. This is not an incremental thing that you do in your lab and a little startup here and there. No, this is about scale. Whatever 10 billion people consume will produce a gigaton scale impact. I'm proposing a theorem out here. Whatever 10 billion people, electricity, heating, cooling, transportation, food, textile, water, steel, cement, information, data. Okay, the rate of increase of the power consumption and energy consumption in data centers is super exponential right now. Okay, so that's the problem that we have. Now, people have realized that this is a challenge, and so just to give you, I'm just talking about the energy CO2, but just to give you an idea, these are not, so the last time the Earth experienced a comparable concentration of CO2 was 3 to 5 million years ago, when the temperature was 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer, and the sea level was 10 to 20 meters higher than now. And there's evidence, Earth evidence of this in the past. And I talked about energy and CO2, but frankly, this is about water. This is about food and agriculture. You have to feed those people. We need higher increased productivity in food without messing up the atmosphere. If you eat a lot of beef or red meat, this is really bad, because for every kilogram of beef, it's like driving your car for 100 miles. Okay? That's the equivalent of CO2. Biodiversity, ecology, global health, all of them. The disease vectors are moving north, they're changing because of the temperature and the conditions. So this is what we call sustainability. It's not just climate, but climate affects all of them. So people have realized that this is a challenge. So in COP26, national governments all got together, and this has been going on from COP21. So there's a joke out here that I'll propose. How many COPs does it take to arrest climate change? More than 26. That's what it is. So, all the major nations, China has a net zero emissions economy 2060, United States 20. These are all the top of the major polluters. United States and India's got 2070 and everything. Governments have realized this is a problem. They made a commitment. Corporations, more than 50% Fortune 500 companies, they made a climate commitment. The aggregate total revenue is $20 trillion, about the US GDP. Okay, so people have realized it's a commitment. This is like, for those of you who are married, this is like marriage. You made a commitment. The details have not been worked out. Okay, we are working out the details. This year there was, of course, a historic climate bill, or Inflation Reduction Act, and before that, the infrastructure bill. Okay, and that, this is very important. This is necessary, but not sufficient. Okay, and it's a long haul. This is not going to be solved in 5 years or 7 years. This is going to take the next 20 years, and this next decade is probably one of the most consequential decade that we'll face. Just so you know, the consumers, this is younger generation, Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Zs. This is existential for them. Some of us may be gone after the next 20 years. It's their problem, and we have to solve it for them. And if you look at the interest, just the Google searches on sustainable products, it has gone, thankfully, super exponentially also. Okay, but we have only 5 years of data. Okay, exponential, super, whatever. It is going up. Very important. It's going up. And not just in the United States. This is global. Because people realize this is a real issue, maybe not as much for our generation, but the future generations. So governments are changing. Corporations are changing. They're on their way. They don't know exactly how to get to net zero and climate commitments. Academia has to change. And this is an issue that spans all of academia. This is not just a business school issue, or engineering, or science, or humanities, or law, social sciences, all of it. This is all of academia. And the question is, how do you structure academia when it's an issue like that? because we are neatly divided into business school and law school, etc. And so as a result of that, we felt that we had to create a new type of organization. And so that's what Stanford has kind of launched this, with the idea that it has to integrate across campus. Yes, we have named the Doerr School of Sustainability, but what has happened over the last few months is essentially created a microcosm of the whole campus. We have faculty from engineering, from business, from School of Earth, School of Law, etc. And we are taking this on. And we are not the only ones. There are many other academic institutions, and we hope that every academic institution takes it on, because this is the defining issue of the 21st century. And all our schools and colleges and all were developed in the 20th century, some in the 19th, some even in the 17th century. We got to change. We got to adapt to the challenges of our times. And that's, I can go into the details in the Q&A. But on my office wall, I have an indigenous proverb, which I think is appropriate in the title of the talk, is we do not inherit this earth from our ancestors. That's the wrong way to think about it. We borrow it from our children. And it is really for the sake of our children and grandchildren that we got to do this. Let me stop here. Happy to answer questions.
Avanish.
Maybe you could tell who you are and just...
Sure. Avanish Sahai, tech executive for a long time. And thank you for scaring the bejesus out of us. But you mentioned academia has to change. How about politicians? We're stuck in a country where the political divide sees this as two very different issues. How do we influence that change?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm not a politician. Maybe, I don't know if you asked Ro Khanna about this yesterday. I missed his talk. Yes, it is a political issue as well. At the end of the day, it's all about the people. If people understand what's going on, then politicians will have to represent their people. Now, are we in a representative democracy? Partly. There's corporate interest democracy as well, you know. And so but corporations are realizing that this is bad for business, right? And so they have to pivot. Now, some of the commitments that were made without really realizing what they're making, what the commitment really is and what they need to do. Now they realize some of the more progressive corporations are looking at this as a business opportunity and reimagining the business because the fundamentals are just changing, right? And so I think that's happening if people start understanding. And you know, we had a very famous elderly statesman at Stanford by the name of Schultz, and some of you may remember. And he had a nice way of saying this, that at some point people will be mugged by reality. And what I showed of the extreme events, I wrote an op-ed in New York Times right after the Texas freeze in February 21, and the opening line is that we are playing Russian roulette with climate change. It's not a question of if, but when such an event is going to come to your neighborhood. So this is the reality that we're facing. And what we need to do is one, there's a vacuum. It could be filled by many voices. One voice is that here to explain what's going on. The other voice can be filled with garbage. And I think it's very important for people who follow this to actually explain to the public, this is what's going on. And thereby get the people involved. And hopefully then the politicians will follow.
Hi. Thank you very much, Dr. Majumdar. Fantastic. And
if you just say your name.
Yes, Akhtar Bacha. It's working, right? Yeah, Akhtar Bacha from University of Washington. And thank you very much for this amazing presentation. And clearly one of the things that you have highlighted is consumption and consumption patterns. And, Bill Gates, who was at your center a couple of weeks ago and, was out talking about how it's not going to be possible to tell African nations to stop consuming and other nations to stop consuming. So how are we dealing with this disparity? Because on one side, market forces and consumption have actually led us to this situation, but now we were banking on innovation to actually solve it, and I'm not necessarily sure that in 20 years we can actually do that. So how are you thinking about it?
You know, I don't have a good answer for you, to be honest. We have to think about a circular economy. We have to think about what we produce and recycling and reusing. The good news is that the industry has shown, for example, in aluminum, 75% of the aluminum that we use in our cans are actually recycled. We use only 25% of the natural resources. That is not true for textiles, for example, right? That is not true for other things. And so, we have to be more resource efficient. I mean, if I could use less clothes, I would do it. I've told my family, don't give me a shirt or t-shirt or pant in my birthday. Please don't do that. I would rather put that money in some charity or something, right? Let's not consume more. But that's just me, and that's the habit. But me doing something may not change. This has to be at scale, right? And so the understanding of the implications of consumption have to be there. I would love to see the recycle part elevated, and there's a lot of in the fashion industry, frankly, this is going on. I don't quite follow that, frankly, but this is about goods in general: recycle, reuse, repurpose, etc. Right? And so I think that's one way to do it. But I don't know the business model to make money by consuming less. I just don't know. And if there is some innovation on that one, that will go a long, long way. I can tell you that.
Hi.
It's your generation.
Hi, I'm Priyanka Pandey. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think you highlighted a lot of important points about sustainability and consumption. I just wanted to get your thoughts on soil and how that was being, as you said, academia has to change as well, and how that's something that we have to make people more aware about. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I think more and more people are starting to realize that soil is an ecosystem, and the loss of organic content is what turns soil into sand, and that's something that we really need to work on. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Priyanka, right?
Yes.
What a terrific question. What a terrific question. We have decarbonized the soil. A lot of the CO2 that is from the atmosphere came from our soil because the organic matter got degraded and became CO2. We need to recarbonize the soil. What I did not show, and I didn't want to get into too much data and all of that, is that we need negative emissions. If you want to keep it below 2 degrees, we need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere at the rate of roughly 10 gigatons of CO2 per year. Okay, so that's kind of all the IPCC models and everything have shown. We got to have negative emissions. We got to remove the CO2, because once you put the CO2 out there, it stays there for several hundred years. It doesn't go. So the atmosphere is like a big capacitor. So how do you remove CO2 from the atmosphere? Well, one way to do that, we grow crops every year. Only less than 10% of the crop is actual food. The rest of it, the crop residue, what do we do today? We burn them in many parts of the world, including in Punjab and all. We burn the crop residues, and many other, it's given as fodder to livestock, which is eaten, and then it goes out again, right? But if you ask the question, how much CO2 have we absorbed from the atmosphere annually in the crop residue? Guess what the number is? Roughly 10 gigatons of CO2 per year. What I would love to see innovations, and this is going on as we speak, and a business model, if you can scale it, to invest in our farmers, to take the crop residue, make it a biochar so that no degradation can happen by organisms to produce methane, otherwise methane could be produced, and put it in the soil. Okay, and recarbonize the soil. at the rate of 10 gigatons. So you're solving two problems then. The co-benefits are immense. You're taking CO2 from the atmosphere and you're making the soil better for our farmers.
Hi.
We have a question here.
Sorry, Vaibhav Parikh here from Nishit Desai Associates. I'm a lawyer, Indian lawyer, helping US company to business in India. We have been focusing quite on climate tech as our area. And one of the things which I thought, right, what you said is so important that it's something which one has to look at it as, we have to reduce. If we can't reduce, we have to reuse. If we can't reuse, we have to recycle. Now, that awareness among people, I don't think it's going to happen overnight unless there's an awareness that this is not just a lifestyle change, this is a climate change. And one of the things which I always felt, the challenging effort in front of government, in front of academia, in front of industry, is not just to do what they are doing, but also create the awareness among individual people of how important this is for their sustainability and their survival. I don't think at this point of time that awareness and that seriousness has actually come in to it individual people, and where some of us who are convinced that yes, it's a survival situation, we don't even know what we should do, or we feel sometimes helpless of what we can do, because what we can do would not move a needle so much. So the question, and some of us actually wait for technologies like this coming and solving the problem for us. So the question which I really have is, how do you think the connection between companies, academia, politicians, government, right, on creating this kind of awareness and telling them what individual things, what a person can do, which will move the needle, and showing them how the needle is moved so that they feel that their effort is actually contributing to their survival?
That's a great question. How do you mobilize? That's what you're at. And frankly, we'll try to do our part, because we are changing our curricula on this issue, but that's inward Stanford looking. We are also going to use that for our outward looking education, and not just, we're not calling it education, we're calling mobilization through education, because this has to be done. And I have now under me an associate dean that I have placed for international partnerships, because this cannot be done by Stanford alone. There's no way. We are a small institution in the big scheme of things. We need to partner with academic institutions worldwide to get the education material that we understand from our science, from what we know today, and just put it out there, right? You didn't bring this up, but it's a very important point that we cannot pin the climate change and sustainability issues on the global south. Most of the CO2 that is out in the atmosphere is from US, Europe, Japan, and the developed world. It's our problem. The people in the global south are trying to feed themselves. So they cannot be responsible. If they want economic growth, yes, we have to give them economic growth as part of an international environmental justice, but with the idea that if they can leapfrog to a new technology, that is better for them, I would rather see that happen. I know you didn't ask this question, but this is an international issue which has a lot of trust that has been broken or breaking right now. And so I think that's also part of the education of who actually contributed to this problem and what responsibility do they have.
One last question, please. Shaker?
Can you use a mic?
There it is. Good morning. That was scary, quick, honest, And I think the question about how it gets to more people and gets translated is a pretty critical one. But in the panel on climate with Varun there and Amol, there was a lot of conversation about, has the political consensus, because of the passage of IRA, how is that embedded into the system so it isn't overturned with the stroke of a pen in 25 and reversal of all the accords? And one of the answers given, which I thought was quite brilliant, but obviously very hard to execute, is how do you create a consensus in the oil and gas industry, who is at this point fighting for its survival? And this used to be, at one point, with Standard Oil, the largest public caps in the entire world. Not that Exxon and BP are small today, or Chevron, but they are no longer the dominant market forces in terms of the overall markets. But how do you co-opt them? How do you create a bridge? So it tries to facilitate two things. One is you've got to get coal miners to renewables, theoretically. And second, you have to get the companies to start figuring out they can make money doing this. We did it with the car industry to an extent, right? And it was regulation, taxes, incentives, clubs, stakes. So have you thought about that? Because at the end of the day, if we don't solve that, I'm sorry, we can do all the public education we want, but people have made up their minds how they're going to vote already.
Great question. I have to deal with it almost on a daily or weekly basis. And there are protests going on in Stanford against fossil fuel companies, and frankly, some of it rightly so. So this is a tricky problem. I'll give you a few points out here. One is that the fossil fuel companies in the past have not, they have not done themselves any favors to build trust with the public. Not all of them. You cannot paint the whole industry with one brush, but some of them did not act in a way that builds or restores trust with the community. Very important. Trust, at the end of the day, public acceptance of something that you're selling or the way you're behaving is very important. At the end of the day, it's not just your shareholder. The whole public is your shareholder if you are if you're selling to the public. So that's number one. Number two, and I've said this in a New York Times interview, is that those who, as you pointed out, those who don't pivot will not survive. You've seen with the coal industry, by the way, in the United States, the coal museum in Kentucky has solar panels on its roof. Okay? So I think the message is there that they have to pivot. Otherwise, they're not going to survive. And the same thing is true in the oil and gas industry. The challenge is that how fast are they moving? Okay? They have know-how. If you want to do geothermal, guess who has the know-how of subsurface geothermal? They do. If you want to do offshore wind and you build offshore structures in the deep water, not in the shallow. Shallow is easy. But the deep water, who has the know-how? So they have know-how, and some of them are trying to pivot. The question is how fast, right? They have to run their business. After all, they have shareholders and they have to still pivot. And this is the tricky thing. I mean, I hate to be on a board of an oil company right now. They're in trouble otherwise, right? So the question is, do you co-opt them or do you cancel them? That's the issue, right? And really the question is about two things. One is trust. If you look at the trust, you would say, I don't want to trust these guys because they haven't been trustworthy. Not all of them, again. You can't paint the whole industry with a single brush, but some of them have not, right? On the other hand, we have a problem to solve, right? And they have the know-how, and they're trying to pivot. They want to be part of the solution. So that's the ethical question that we all have. Now, this, as I said, I'm dealing with this on a daily basis, talking to students, various groups, as to how they feel about it. The faculty have different viewpoints. So I don't think this is a monolithic issue. This is a diverse, complex issue that needs to be addressed with issues, at least in academia, on one hand, academic freedom, on the other hand, some ethical considerations, who we partner with, etc. And this is a societal issue as well. I would rather they pivot, be part of the solution, and actually solve some problems, right? And build trust with the community through those means in a way that they can allocate enough resources to solve the problem. And it's not greenwashing anymore then. Okay? Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arun.